Nadine, so we've been seeing disturbingly high levels of hateful speech and hate crimes. Yet the United States is virtually alone in the world in treating hate speech as constitutionally protected. There seems to be a growing sentiment to take lessons from other countries to restrict the type of speech that has the potential to fuel discrimination and violence. And all of you have mentioned violence. So, what do you think about that approach?
Well, I am firmly committed to fighting discrimination, hatred, stereotyping, not to mention fascism. I wrote a book a couple of years ago, I'll hold it up here, called Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. And note that the only verb in that title is resist. I am absolutely committed to resisting the tide of hatred, and not least of which, let me say, tying together some themes that Chad and Bill talked about. My father was a victim of Nazi persecution in Germany. Many of his relatives were slaughtered by the Nazis. He was young enough that they used him for slave labor instead, although their slave labor was a system of working people to death rather than gassing them to death. So believe me, if I thought that censoring more than we do in this country, or censoring more than Germany did during the Weimar Republic, would have prevented the rise of fascism, would prevent hatred and hateful violence today, I would be all in favor of it. But the historical record and the current record are to the contrary, and I am absolutely convinced that it is precisely those who are resisting, those who are oppressed, those who do not have political power because they are members of racial minorities or religious minorities or political minorities, are the ones who absolutely depend on a robust freedom of speech. Now, that said, Alelia, I really want to get away from a binary that too often oversimplifies these debates about speech. The United States allows, correctly in my view, punishment of a great deal of hateful speech. The question is whether we should allow even more authority to government to punish hateful speech. So in a nutshell, we allow speech to be punished, including speech with a hateful message, if in a particular context, it directly causes certain serious, specific, imminent harm, such as what lawyers call a true threat, targeted harassment, targeted bullying, intentional incitement of imminent violence, and certainly hate crimes, which you referred to in your question. Certainly those can be punished with so-called enhanced penalties. That is, when something that is already a crime, such as an assault or vandalism, is committed against a particular person or a particular institution because of a discriminatory motive on the basis of race, religion, gender, so forth, that can and should be punished as a hate crime. Now, the problem in the Weimar Republic was not that they were not punishing hate speech. They had hate speech laws that went much further than in the United States, and basically followed what is now still followed in Germany and many other European countries. Speech that conveys a hateful message, even if you can't show any direct connection to likely harm or violence, just because the idea is hateful, it can be suppressed. And there were many prosecutions in the Weimar Republic, including of leading Nazis, including of the notorious Julius Streicher, who was ultimately committed at the Nuremberg trials as well. And the leading Jewish organization at the time said that most of these prosecutions were carried out very capably. They weren't sabotaged. And obviously that was not enough to prevent the rise of Nazism. To the contrary, the Nazis treated these trials as propaganda platforms. They got attention and sympathy they otherwise never would have. The problem is that they got away with violence. They got away with literal murder and assault against Jews, other minorities, their political opponents, communists, socialists, and so forth. And this is why I'm really concerned in this country today. One of the readings that I suggested was it was a cover story in the New York Times Magazine a couple of years ago by Janet Reitman. It's being turned into a book. I talked to her recently. She told me that the article is still basically accurate, that at every level of law enforcement in this country, from the FBI on down to local police, there has just been a dearth of sufficiently serious enforcement of criminal laws against violent acts, against conspiracy, against plotting violence by white nationalists and white supremacists. And law enforcement has been complaining. It's been drained of resources. This has not been treated as a sufficient priority, in part because one of the causal factors here was after 9/11, the biggest priority became so-called international terrorism, and efforts and attention and resources were channeled away from domestic terrorism, despite the fact that far more people have been killed in this country by white nationalists and white supremacists after the 9/11 attacks than by so-called Islamic or international terrorism. One other point, which is that in Germany and France today have probably the strongest anti-hate speech laws in the world, which are very strictly enforced. And I hope everybody who follows current events knows that those laws have not in any way headed off horrible violence against many minorities, including Jews, including refugees, including immigrants, including Roma. So let's keep our eyes on punishing the speech that is closely tied to violence. Let's use other speech as a resource to help law enforcement pinpoint those who are plotting or planning or engaging or threatening in violence. Their speech can actually be helpful to law enforcement, and let's ramp up law enforcement and domestic anti-terrorism efforts.